Tell us who you are and what position do you hold at Martin Guitars?
My name's Jason Ahner, and I manage the archives in the museum at Martin Guitar. So I've been with the company about 11 years. I actually started in the factory in the polishing department. And then I worked for about 5.5 years in customer service where, one of the things, I've been fascinated with guitar since I was a little kid, and I've always loved history.
Right.
So it's like, here's the perfect blend of both. And I had been studying the history of the company for about 15 years before I actually started here.
Right.
But I thought I knew quite a bit when I started, but working in customer service, you really get to know like all the odds and ends, and you get asked all sorts of questions. And if you want a great education on Martin Guitar, apply for a job here in customer service because you'll learn a lot.
I can imagine. How many guitars does Martin have in its lineup these days? I know there's the traditional guitars that everybody knows, but they've really kind of in the last decade or so really kind of expanded their offerings. So kind of tell us a little bit about what goes on at Martin these days.
We have well over, I think it's close to around 100 different models.
Wow.
You factor in all the different finish packages and everything. So, at the Nazareth factory here, you're looking at 15 series and above. So all your 15, 16, 17 series up to your standard series, which is kind of that the trademark Martin lineup where you have styles 18 through 45. Then obviously we have limited editions we do every year, whether they're artist signature models. Like right now we're building a Rich Robinson signature model. And then we have our custom shop, which pretty much anything you can dream of, they can build.
Right.
They also build our authentic line of guitars, which we normally take an instrument from our museum collection and try to replicate it as closely as possible, going down to the way they did the finish, the way the braces were shaped. What we do is we take those instruments and run them through an X-ray machine.
Okay.
And then we can take a look at exactly how they were braced and, everything on the inside, and then replicate it. So in vintage guitars, especially in vintage Martin guitars, especially that pre-war period, what we call the golden era, when they sell, you're talking about, could be hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Right.
And it's not because they were owned by somebody famous. It's just because really they're modern acoustic guitars. And because of the way they age, they sound so good.
Right.
So one of the things that we try to do when we build our authentics is, it's difficult replicating the sound of a guitar that's 80 years old in a new instrument.
Right.
So now on our authentics, we use our vintage tone system, which is the top is torrefied, which gives the guitar more of a vintage sound than just a new piece of wood.
Okay. Now I've read like guys that like buy a new guitar and they stick it in front of a speaker for days on end to like get that vibration into the wood.
Exactly.
Do you guys feel that it's the sound waves, or is it something chemical or structural in the wood that ages over time?
It's a few things. Mm-hmm. Obviously, the more you play a guitar, the better it's going to sound, because you're loosening because we take a tree that's standing in a forest, we cut it down, cut it into these thin pieces, put strings on it, and it's stiff.
Right.
Even though the wood's thin, it's still kind of stiff. So the more you play a guitar, it loosens the fibers of the wood.
Okay.
And as the guitar ages, the wood starts to lighten a bit, and it can vibrate more freely. So, there's definitely people that do that. Will stick the guitar in front of their speaker, or there's that tone right machine that you put on the bridge that sends vibrations through the top. So there's a few different things you can do to help, advance that process if you can't play your guitar 8 hours a day. Right.
Right. Okay. So, give our listeners who might not know, like aren't obsessive about guitars like we are, give them since we're going to talk about the Jimmy Rogers Blue Yodel guitar, give them a brief history of the Martin Guitar Company from its founding at 1833 to 1928 when they made the guitar for Jimmy Rogers.
Well, the company was founded by Christian Frederick Martin Sr. A little background on him. He was born in a town in Germany called Markneukirchen. And it was really known, they were really known for violin building there. And Christian's father was a cabinet builder, but most of the time he wasn't building furniture. He was building violin cases.
Okay.
But he was also one of the earliest guitar builders in Germany at that time. So if you look back, the earliest six-string guitar was built in 1779, so less than 20 years before Christian was born.
Okay.
But it was catching on in throughout Europe. And as Christian got older, his father saw that he had more interest in building guitars than he did in building furniture. So he ended up getting Christian an apprenticeship with Johann Stauffer in Vienna, Austria. He was in Vienna for a little over a decade. He met his future wife, Ottilie Kuhl, there. They got married, had their first child, C.F. Martin Jr., and then they moved back to Markenkirchen. And I guess their dream was, we're going to set up a family home and a shop here in Germany and live happily ever after. But the issue was there was a guild system. And the Violin Makers Guild saw the potential of the guitar, and they thought they had the sole right to build any stringed instrument.
Okay.
So there were these court battles that ensued. And every time the court sided with Martin and the cabinet makers because the guitars Martin was building were the best they had ever seen.
Yeah. Right.
So this goes on for a few years, and then he decides, you know what, I need a new opportunity. He's tired of the restrictive guild system. So his family and him leave Germany, arrive in New York City in November of 1833. They spent about 6 years in New York City, and then they had thought about moving back to Germany because they didn't really like the atmosphere there. But luckily they had a family friend in the Nazareth area that Ottilie Martin visited, and she wrote a letter to her husband and said, this place is great. There's a large German-speaking population. It's rolling countryside. We need to move here. So in 1839, the Martin family moved to the Nazareth area. And then eventually when the Moravians that owned Nazareth opened up the community, they purchased land and built their homes and the North Street factory here in Nazareth.
Does that factory still exist?
It does. We house our guitar makers connection there where you can buy parts and kits from. Mm-hmm. So that factory was in operation from 1859 until 1964 when the second North Street factory that we're in now was open.
Right.
So as the 1800s are moving along, C.F. Martin, pretty much builds what becomes the American guitar. He invents X bracing in 1843, refines the shape and dimensions of guitars. After he dies, the company passes to his son. So that was 1873. And then his son really doesn't do much to change the company. He kind of standardizes the lineup a little bit more. He does bring in steam-powered equipment in 1887 to help modernize the company. Because if you look back then, there were companies out of Chicago, mostly Lion and Healy, that were building 100,000 guitars a year.
Right.
And that's what we build now.
Right.
But back in the 1880s, Martin was building a few hundred.
I think that's what a lot of people don't know, that Chicago used to be the kind of the guitar building capital of the world at one time.
Exactly. Yeah. All of it was Lion and Healy. They were building Washburn, and then you had like the Sears and Roebuck guitars and
Harmony and Kay.
Harmony, Stella, Kay. Yeah, all of those brands were coming out of Chicago.
Right.
And they were just, they were mass producing them. So if you look back then and compare it to now, it's pretty equal to our production now. And it's pretty fascinating that they were able to build at that scale. Now, one of the things...
That's why the necks all fall off of them, too.
Exactly. The huge difference is the 100,000 guitars we build now are high quality.
Correct,
right. What they were building back then, like you said, the necks fall off or bridges fall off, all of those issues. And they really weren't using premium materials like Martin used.
Right.
Even by the 1880s, Martin had built that reputation as, the finest guitar builder in America. And it was something that they would never stray from. Right. But they did want to advance the company. So they brought in steam-powered equipment. Then C.F. Martin Sr. dies in 1888. And then his son, C.F. Martin Jr. dies in 1888. And his son, Frank Henry Martin, who's only 22 at the time, takes over. he's a little more outgoing. He wants to grow the company beyond the guitar. So he introduces the mandolin first in the 1890s, and then eventually the ukulele in the 19 teens.
Okay.
And the ukulele is one of the reasons why Martin was able to survive the Great Depression.
Okay.
I mean, sales were so good throughout the 20s. They were building some years 3 times as many ukuleles as guitars.
Wow. Okay.
And then also under Frank's watch, the company invents the Dreadnought in 1916.
Mm-hmm.
And then the orchestra model, the OM-28 in 1929.
Okay.
Which is considered the first modern flat top guitar.
Wow. I just got to visit Wayne Henderson in Rugby, Virginia, and he's got one of the original OMs that still has the banjo style tuners on it. And that is an original amazing instrument.
Yeah, they had pyramid bridges, the banjo style tuners. A few years later in 29, Martin would introduce our belly style bridge, which helped support the top a little more. And then eventually a couple years later, start using Grovered geared tuners similar to what we would use now.
Right. Now, what musical trends were happening in the early 20th century that drove this guitar design kind of renaissance? And tell us how guitars were marketed. You know, one of the common conventional wisdoms is that the small guitars were marketed to women to play in the parlors of their homes and stuff like that. So tell us a little bit about the marketing strategy of early guitars, say from the late 1800s into the 1920s.
Well, that's where you hear that term parlor guitar a lot. It's used kind of loosely now. Some people even refer to like a Martin 00 as a parlor. But traditionally, if you look at a Martin size 1, which we don't even build anymore, that and smaller would be your parlor guitar. And that's exactly where that term comes from, is they were played by women in the parlors of their homes to entertain guests.
Right.
So early on, the majority of guitars were built for women. As the guitar gains popularity, the sizes get bigger. Martin builds the first single O in 1854, the first double O in 1858, and then they don't build the first triple O until the early 1900s.
Okay.
Because what you're starting to see then is steel strings trickling in.
Right.
And that's a direct result of Hawaiian music.
Okay.
So in the 1880s, there's 2 musicians from Hawaii who are friends, Makia Kealakai and Joseph Kukuku. So they take piano wire and string a guitar with it, invent this brand new playing style.
Right.
And as Hawaiian music starts to spread in the mainland, the popularity of the steel string guitar also starts to grow.
Right.
Then there's the San Francisco Pan American Exposition in 1915, which featured Hawaiian music. And then from there, you really see, especially with Martin, 1, ukulele production, and then 2, Martin start building steel string guitars on a regular basis.
What year do you feel that Martin really committed themselves to building the steel string instruments? I've heard a different range of years, so I'd like to hear it directly from you.
It's really 1927.
1927? Okay.
Yeah, by that point, steel strings would become standard. Gut strings were still available on a special order basis, but I mean, that change happened pretty quickly.
Yeah. Okay.
You know, they're building their first steel string guitars 1915 and 1916 for, they started out building for one of their customers, Southern California Music. They were building private label instruments for them. And then eventually their largest customer, the Ditson Company from New York, starts requesting steel strings. And then from there, you just see it take off. And then Martin introduces their first model that's only offered with steel strings in 1922.
Okay.
So it's a very quick transition for a company that at that point was almost 100 years old.
Right. Let's back up just a little bit for people who don't know about Martin's lettering and the number system. Tell us a little bit about, we've thrown these numbers around like 1, 000 and those kind of things. So tell us what the numbers designate and then what the letters designate on the different models of Martin guitars.
Okay. So that first number is the size of the body.
Okay.
So it's actually the higher the number, the smaller the guitar. Like a size 5 is smaller than a size 1.
Is there anything smaller than a 5?
No.
Other than a ukulele, I guess.
Yeah. We do offer, we build them only in our custom shop now, but it wasn't introduced until the early 1980s, a size 7.
Okay.
But the reason why it's called a size 7, it's a 7/8 size dreadnought.
Okay, gotcha.
But I mean, since the beginning of the company, the size 5 was the smallest.
Okay, gotcha.
And then you would work your way down. And then, I mean, right now, the smallest style we're building in a full-size guitar is a single O.
Okay.
And then you have your double O, triple O, an M body, which is also referred to as a 4O, 4-aught. And then you get into your Ds, your dreadnoughts.
Right.
And where that comes from is when Martin first built the guitar, the largest warship at the time was the HMS Dreadnought from the British Navy. And so they borrowed the name of the ship for the guitar because it was so much bigger than anything they had ever built. They weren't quite sure if their number system would work with it.
Right, right. And so what was driving this increase in body size and the steel strings? You mentioned Hawaiian music, and then the recording industry and radio industry are blossoming at this time, and string bands are starting to happen. Were people looking for more volume out of guitars? What was really going on that drove this size increase?
Exactly. That's what it was, volume. Because at this point, the guitar is a very popular instrument on the vaudeville circuit, especially Hawaiian style guitar.
Right.
And there was no amplification at that point. And so in order for them to get more volume, one, they needed steel strings, and two, they needed a guitar that was larger.
Right.
To get more projection.
Right.
Now, I also wanted to touch on, we were talking about the sizes.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at a Martin guitar, you see like a D28. So the D is for dreadnought.
Correct.
And then you have that 28 number.
Mm-hmm.
So where that comes from, that was the original wholesale price of a guitar like that back before the Civil War.
Wow. Okay.
So if you would have ordered a 128, it would have cost the wholesale dealer $28.
Okay.
So what happened was Martin's distributors and them became so familiar with those numbers that when they needed to increase prices, instead of changing it to like a 29 or a 30, they just started calling it the style number or the number of ornamentation.
Okay.
So now we consider it just an appointment level, which is a combination of specific woods and binding materials.
So the lower the number, the less fancy the guitar generally is.
Exactly. So if you look at one of our style 15s, it has the rosette inlay, but it doesn't have any binding or top inlay.
Mm-hmm.
So as you go up, they get a little bit more ornate until you get to the style 45, which has pearl all over the top, back, and sides of the body, the fingerboard, the headstock.
Right. It's a bling.
That's what Jimmy Rogers wanted.
It's a bling machine, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Now, there was a 76 style, wasn't there? And that was a special bicentennial guitar at one point?
Yeah, the D76. It was kind of like a D35 with a 3-piece back, but it had the eagle inlaid on the headstock, stars on the fingerboard. So that was more of a kind of a commemorative edition.
Right.
So when you're looking at our core lineup, which was really styles 15 through 45.
Right. Okay.
Anything else outside of those is either a limited or a special edition.
Now, although Martin is viewed by a lot of people as a pretty traditional company, Martin makes guitars out of other materials. Correct? Isn't that correct? Also, they've been doing that for since the 90s.
In 1998, we introduced our X series, which the tops, backs, and sides are made from a material called HPL. It's a high pressure laminate wood fiber composite.
Okay.
Now, some of those guitars do have a solid spruce top and then HPL back and sides, but they have some combination of that. So one, we look at sustainability.
Right.
I mean, Martin has been building guitars out of wood for almost 200 years now.
Right.
And a lot of the woods we use are becoming harder and harder for us to get. You know, rosewoods, mahoganies. So we introduced that as an alternative.
Right.
And then we look at other species of woods that we might be able to use for tone woods, like, you know, cherry or cirrus or sipo, that aren't your traditional woods that were used years ago. And part of it is educating the people that buy our guitars on, you know, you don't need a guitar that's built from Adirondack spruce and Brazilian rosewood for it to sound good. We can use these other materials and it could sound just as good. But there's kind of this, you know, historical love affair with Martins and those woods that were used, the mahogany, rosewood, ebony, all of those. So it can be a little bit difficult, but with the way the supply is now, it's becoming more and more difficult for us to get certain woods.
Right, and it seems like so as the style number goes up on a guitar, does the selection process for those materials also become stricter?
Definitely. Yeah. So, like a style 16 would have a different grade of spruce on the top than a style 45.
Right.
They're both going to be Sitka spruce, which comes from the northwestern United States up into Canada and into Alaska. But I mean, a 45 is going to have premium woods.
Right.
And it's the same goes with the back and sides. I mean, the 45, style 45 is going to have premium rosewood for the back and the sides. It's East Indian rosewood, same wood that's on a D28.
Right.
Is it going to sound better? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. That's one of the things, but it comes down to the appearance.
So it's graded basically on appearance. Does anybody like walk around tapping it with their knuckles and stuff like that? Or
no, it's graded on appearance.
Yeah. Okay.
And I mean, that's wood's a funny thing because you never know how it's going to behave under string tension.
Right.
I mean, a great looking piece of wood to one person might not sound as good as a piece that's, not as aesthetically pleasing.
Right. But, yeah. I mean, I remember those Martins from the 60s when the Brazilian rosewood was becoming more scarce, and they started using the wood with the crazy, some of really crazy figuring in it. And is it true that they created the D35 guitar in response to the lack of larger pieces of Brazilian rosewood, or is that mythology?
Exactly. Yeah. So in 1965, Brazil placed an embargo on the export of rosewood from their country. So Martin had these smaller pieces, and instead of just discarding them, they came up with the idea to build a guitar with a 3-piece back, and that's where the D35 came from.
Right. And there's bracing differences in that guitar as compared to a D28 also.
It is. Yeah. So a D35 has 1/4-inch braces, and then a D28 is 5/16.
Okay.
So I always tell everybody, if you're looking for the maximum volume and bass response from a guitar, then a D35 is going to give you that, just because that lighter bracing, everything is moving more freely.
Right. Now, unlike some of its famous competitors, Martin is known for meticulous record keeping. Is that true going all the way back to the founding? And if it is, how did that culture survive over, multiple generations of ownership?
I mean, yeah, one of the things about the Martin family, they did retain a lot of records. I mean, we have the oldest document we have in our collection is Johann George Martin, who was C.F. Martin Sr.'s father, his baptismal certificate from 1765. So we're talking about, we have a document older than the United States.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty wild. That's wild. Yeah.
And it was just the German tradition. They held on to things.
Right.
And so for us, I mean, there's definitely periods where there's some items missing because one, for a long time, a lot of these records and old sales ledgers that we have in our archives. Meanwhile, I didn't mention I am in the archive room here at Martin.
Right.
Were just kept in the attic at the North Street factory.
Okay.
And so they didn't think about, one, they thought about keeping them, but they didn't think about keeping them in the right environment for preservation for future generations. But I mean, luckily, a large amount of the records survive. There's certain periods where we don't have the sales ledgers like the 1840s or like shipping records after certain periods. But for a company that is as old as Martin, to have the amount of information that we have is pretty amazing. I mean, we have C.F. Martin Sr.'s canceled checks from the 1850s. When's the last time you saw your own canceled check?
Never. Yeah, only online as some kind of image.
Yeah.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. Now, you said you worked in the customer service department. If somebody buys a vintage Martin guitar and they don't know much about the guitar, can they reach out to the Martin customer service people with the serial number and gain information about that guitar?
They can. And usually what happens, they contact me and I'll do a search of our records for them. And, a lot of times we can tell when production was started, when it was completed. And certain years we can tell when the guitar was shipped or sold.
Wow. Now, the guitar building process at Martin, is it an assembly line kind of process, or does an individual craftsperson work on a complete guitar? Tell us a little bit about the process of how a guitar is built there.
So there's about 300 steps that go into building one of our guitars.
Mm-hmm.
And we have specific departments to do a specific task. So we have, a binding department. We have a brace shaping department, top gluing, all of that. So it works its way through the factory, through these departments until it eventually gets to final assembly and then final inspection.
Right.
Now our custom shop is almost like a small factory within the larger factory where a lot of those operations are done.
Okay.
There's just specific things like filling and finishing that they don't have capabilities in there. So that'll go through with standard production models. But when you're talking about, the brace shaping, gluing the tops and backs, the neck shaping, fretting, all of those aspects can be done in the custom shop on those instruments.
Now, do you guys use CNC for making necks and things like these days?
We do.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, that was something that was introduced in the 1990s.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we still hand finish everything, but we get that raw profile off the CNC machine.
Right.
And some of the things we look at when we implement machinery like that is, one, how efficiently can it do the work? And two, we look at the longevity of our workforce. Because when you're cutting necks on a bandsaw all day long for 20, 30 years, which a lot of our employees, have done in the past, that can result in a lot of repetitive stress injuries, whether it's tendonitis in your elbows, carpal tunnel.
Right.
So, when we look at machinery like that, we look at that impact. One, are we going to be able to build more high quality guitars?
Mm-hmm.
And two, will the people that build these guitars that work here, have longer careers and have less risk of long-term injury?
Right. Well, and it's repeatability too. You get a consistent, product out of that where, a human making something, everyone's going to be a little bit different. And
Exactly.
I guess from a collector standpoint, they like that. But from a builder standpoint, you want to be as efficient as possible. So
because you look at vintage guitars and, I mean, some of them, the necks are shaped, they're the same year, but the necks are shaped totally differently. And that comes down to all of that handwork where
right.
When we build our authentic series, we'll do that basic profile of the 1937 D28 in our museum.
Right.
So every D28 authentic we build is going to have that profile.
Right.
But then we'll also look at guitars from our museum that, the neck profiles are unique and might relate to something now. Like we have a 1930 OM 45 Deluxe in our museum collection. And the neck on that guitar was used as the basis for the neck on our modern deluxe models we build now.
Wow.
We call it our vintage deluxe profile. And what's different about it, it's a little asymmetrical.
Okay.
So as you go down the neck, the point on the back of the neck where your hand would guide down the neck, it naturally rolls your hand over.
Right. Interesting. Wow. That's all very, very cool stuff. As a guitar fan, this is a revelation to me. So following up on that, Martin does a lot of reissues now of their classic designs. When did that trend begin? Was the NY series in the 1960s their first attempt at kind of bringing back a classic design, or did that start any time before that?
No, that was really their first kind of reissue of a model. The NYs stood for New York, so they had, they were mostly smaller bodies, single O's, double O's, and they had slotted headstocks and 12 fret necks, which, those were popular in the folk scene in the 1950s and early 1960s.
Right.
And then Martin started building Dreadnought S models like a D28S, D18S, which were the same thing. They were 12 fret with a slotted headstock, like guitars would have been built before 1934.
Right. Was Martin's original Dreadnoughts were slope shoulders, right?
Yeah, they were. They were 12 fret neck to body joint.
And to bring those slopes down, is that why they then became like a flat shoulder, just to get those other two frets clear of the body?
Yeah, in order for Martin to build 14 fret guitars, they squared off the shoulders on the body and allowed access for the two more frets.
I'm sure that impacts the tone also. I mean, that's
you have to adjust, where the bracing is and all of it based off of, that. But, it had a positive impact because after Martin built the OM28 in 1929, they saw how successful it could be and started changing their entire lineup over. And then eventually in 1934, they changed the dreadnought to the 14 fret neck. And that's where it really takes off with a lot of the early country and bluegrass musicians.
Do you think that that is where people kind of draw that line as of the golden era of Martin guitars at kind of 1934, or does it start a little bit earlier?
Well, it's 1929 through the end of World War II. So like
Gotcha.
1929 to 1945. That's
Okay.
really the period we consider the golden era.
And there's a lot of mythology about the changes that happened to those guitars after World War II in terms of why bracing got heavier. You hear things like the headstocks changed shape because the jigs were wearing out, those kind of things.
That's true. That is true. The form that they used for the headstock became rounded, and it was a gradual thing, and they didn't notice it until those top corners were very rounded. And when they saw it, they're like, this isn't quite right. And so they went back and made new fixtures for it.
Well, when I was at Wayne Henderson's, he has D21s from every year that they were made.
Oh, wow.
And he has them in a line. And so I asked him the same question. He said, well, you can look right here and you can see the gradual change from we went to D21 starting the early 1950s through the 1960s. You can gradually see those headstocks get a little bit more rounded. And then in terms of the bracing, was it because people were putting heavy strings on these guitars and ripping the bridges off? Like, what was going on with the bracing that needed to get heavier?
I mean, that was a factor because I found notes from the mid-1940s from C.F. Martin III, who was running the company at that time. And a medium set of strings was a 14 through 57 set.
Whoa.
They were heavy. So right now we use 13 through 56. Which,
right.
I mean, if you compute that into string tension, it's 186 pounds.
Wow. Okay.
So in the late 1930s, Martin shifts the braces to what's known as rear position to help strengthen the belly of the top. And then eventually they stopped scalloping braces in 1944.
Okay.
And I mean, you see that. So they had bronze strings were that gauge for that 14 through 57. Those went on your larger guitars. And then they had Monel strings, which they considered a lighter gauge, but they were still a 13 through 56, what we consider now medium. Right.
Wow. And just that small change increases the tension. It's like an exponential thing, isn't it?
Because when you shift from our light gauge now is 12 through 54 up to medium gauge, you're adding 21 pounds.
Wow.
So if you're talking close to 200 pounds of tension with that 14 through 57 set. So that's a lot of tension.
Right. And then Martin also backs up their guitars. So in terms of warranty, so is this a response to do less warranty work, or because people are being irresponsible, or what?
Well, I mean, it comes down to the stability of the instrument.
Right.
They notice, and they want, because they don't want to thicken the woods that are used, because then you're going to change the tone. So they want to keep all of that the same. So in order to increase the stability of the top, you have to make some sort of changes.
Right.
But then eventually Martin starts to see the vintage market blow up. And that's when they look at doing guitars with scallop braces again and the herringbone trim around the top. And that's when they introduced the HD28 in the mid 1970s.
Right. So following up on that, Martin does a lot of reissues now of their classic designs. When did that trend begin? Was the NY series in the 1960s their first attempt at kind of bringing back a classic design, or did that start any time before that?
No, that was really their first kind of reissue of a model. The NYs stood for New York, so they had, they were mostly smaller bodies, single O's, double O's, and they had slotted headstocks and 12 fret necks, which those were popular in the folk scene in the 1950s and early 1960s.
Right.
And then Martin started building Dreadnought S models like a D28S, D18S, which were the same thing. They were 12 fret with a slotted headstock, like guitars would have been built before 1934.
Right. Was Martin's original Dreadnoughts were slope shoulders, right?
Yeah, they were. They were 12 fret neck to body joint.
And to bring those slopes down, is that why they then became like a flat shoulder, just to get those other two frets clear of the body?
Yeah, in order for Martin to build 14 fret guitars, they squared off the shoulders on the body and
Right.
allowed access for the 2 more frets.
I'm sure that impacts the tone also. I mean, that's
Yeah, I mean,
pretty-
you have to adjust, where the bracing is and all of it based off of, that. But, I mean, it had a positive impact because after Martin built the OM28 in 1929, they saw how successful it could be and started changing their entire lineup over. And then eventually in 1934, they changed the dreadnought to the 14 fret neck. And that's where it really takes off with a lot of the early country and bluegrass musicians.
Do you think that that is where people kind of draw that line as of the golden era of Martin guitars, that kind of 1934, or does it start a little bit earlier?
Well, it's 1929 through the end of World War II. So like
Gotcha.
1929 to 1945. That's
Okay.
really the period we consider the golden era.
And there's a lot of mythology about the changes that happened to those guitars after World War II in terms of why bracing got heavier. You hear things like the headstocks changed shape because the jigs were wearing out, those kind of things.
That's true.
Well-
That is true. The form that they used for the headstock became rounded, and it was a gradual thing, and they didn't notice it until those top corners were very rounded. And when they saw it, they're like, this isn't quite right. And so they went back and made new fixtures for it.
Well, when I was at Wayne Henderson's, he has D21s from every year that they were made.
Oh,
and,
wow.
And he has them in a line. And so I asked him the same question. He said, well, you can look right here and you can see the gradual change from we went to D21 start in the early 1950s through the 1960s. You can gradually see those headstocks get a little bit more rounded. And then in terms of the bracing, was it because people were putting heavy strings on these guitars and ripping the bridges off? Like, what was going on with the bracing that needed to get heavier?
I mean, that was a factor because I found notes from the mid-1940s from C.F. Martin III, who was running the company at that time. And a medium set of strings was a 14 through 57 set.
Whoa.
They were heavy. So right now we use 13 through 56. Which,
right.
I mean, if you compute that into string tension, it's 186 pounds.
Wow. Okay.
So in the late 1930s, Martin shifts the braces to what's known as rear position to help strengthen the belly of the top. And then eventually they stopped scalloping braces in 1944.
Okay.
And I mean, you see that. So they had bronze strings were that gauge for that 14 through 57. Those went on your larger guitars. And then they had Monel strings, which they considered a lighter gauge, but they were still a 13 through 56, what we consider now medium.
Right. Wow. And just that small change increases the tension. It's like an exponential thing, isn't it? Like it's
because when you shift from our light gauge now is 12 through 54 up to medium gauge, you're adding 21 pounds.
Wow.
So if you're talking close to 200 pounds of tension with that 14 through 57 set. So that's a lot of tension.
Right. And then Martin also backs up their guitars. So in terms of warranty, so is this a response to do less warranty work, or because people are being irresponsible, or what?
Well, I mean, it comes down to the stability of the instrument.
Right.
They notice, and they want, because they don't want to thicken the woods that are used, because then you're going to change the tone. So they want to keep all of that the same. So in order to increase the stability of the top, you have to make some sort of changes.
Right.
But then eventually Martin starts to see the vintage market blow up. And that's when they look at doing guitars with scallop braces again and the herringbone trim around the top. And that's when they introduced the HD28 in the mid 1970s.
Right. All right. Well, let's dig into the meat of this. This is really cool because I know I attended that virtual speaker series that you did over at the Birthplace of Country Music. I was the guy that had to ask the question about Hateful Eight and that awful incident that happened with Martin with the Martin guitar on the set there. But the Blue Yodel guitar, Jimmy Rogers 1928 00045, is currently on display at the Birthplace of Country Music Museum. Tell us what you know about that guitar.
Well, I know Jimmy Rogers, when he got started recording, he was using a 0018. So it's a little smaller, one of Martin's less expensive guitars at that time. And so when he releases his records and royalties start coming in, that's when he orders his Blue Yodel from Martin.
Okay.
So he wanted this name on the fingerboard, Blue Yodel on the headstock. He wanted it to be style 45 with pearl all around the body.
Right.
And then after he received the guitar, he had a sign painter paint thanks on the back so he could flip it over and thank the crowd.
So that was not done by Martin. The thanks on the back was not done by Martin. Okay.
That was not done by Martin. I'm not sure who did that, but it wasn't done by Martin.
Okay.
And I do know that C.F. Martin III was a huge fan of Jimmy Rogers. They corresponded a lot. Jimmy Rogers were referred to, because C.F. Martin III went by Fred or Frederick, his middle name, and Jimmy Rogers would refer to him as Friend Fred in his letters. That's how he would start out. Yeah.
Right.
And so C.F. Martin III wrote a special note that he put on the inside and hand-delivered the guitar to Jimmy Rogers. And now there was some speculation that it was in Washington, D.C., but it was most likely Camden, because that's where Jimmy Rogers would have been recording in 1928.
Right. For the Victor Talkie Machine Company at the time. Was Ralph Peer involved in did you see him in the correspondence at all? We had heard that maybe he helped, talk between Martin and Jimmy Rogers, but you seem to indicate there was a direct connection between Jimmy and Fred. Yeah,
yes, there was.
Okay.
And, yeah, they corresponded. We have quite a few letters from Jimmy Rogers to Martin.
Really? That's got to be amazing to sit and read that kind of stuff. I mean, are they pretty casual, or are they business-like?
Pretty laid back. And, originally they were handwritten, and then eventually went to some typed letters. So I don't know if he had somebody typing the letters for him at that point when he, gained a little bit of success. But they were usually on hotel stationery.
I was just going to ask if you saw any cool stationery or anything like that, because a traveling musician would be in a different spot all the time.
Yeah.
Now, that guitar has a kind of an interesting history, because Jimmy passes away in 1933. So fill us in a little bit about what happens to the guitar after 1933.
So Jimmy's widow has the guitar, and Ernest Tubb comes along, and he was... Jimmy Rogers was a huge influence on him. I mean, early on, that's the style he sung in, but I guess what happened was he had to have a throat operation, and it changed his singing voice. So he kind of comes up with his own style.
Right.
But still, he starts this traveling show with Jimmy's widow, and she allows him to use the Jimmy Rogers 0045.
Okay.
So Ernest Tubb would go on to use it for a number of years.
And then he would flash the back, because he's even got a song called Thanks a Lot that he used to, flash the guitar at people. And then, so was it given to Ernest Tubb, or was it on kind of a permanent loan to Ernest Tubb?
It was a permanent loan, because after I'm not quite sure when the year was, he ended up giving the guitar back.
Okay. And then as far as I know, then the guitar was in the possession of the Jimmy Rogers Museum in Meridian, Mississippi for a long time.
Yes.
Do you know kind of when it arrived in Mississippi?
That I don't know. I don't know that exact date. I just know it was there when Martin did the Jimmy Rogers commemorative edition.
Okay.
That's where the representatives from our company went to view the original guitar and kind of get an idea of how we should replicate it. Because
there is a replica version of that guitar, isn't there?
There is.
And those were for sale, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen a few of those.
Yeah, you could purchase it with or without the thanks on the back if you wanted.
But
the one we have in our museum collection does have, the thanks on the back. And then we actually have a separate back displayed next to the guitar just with the thanks on it. So you can see what the back of the guitar would look like without, having to take it out of the display case.
Right. So it would be a substantially valuable guitar, even if it wasn't owned by Jimmy Rogers. Is that correct?
Well, yeah. I mean, you look at Martin guitars from that period, and especially style 45s, and they're worth quite a bit.
So you're 1 year out of what you consider the golden age, right? You said that's 1929, so you're at 1928. Like,
but I mean, it's close enough because we know,
right?
Yeah, a couple of the factors. I mean, prime factors when it comes to guitars from that era, or if it's built with steel strings.
Correct. Okay.
Which that was originally a steel string guitar, and that's what the majority of people look for because.
Right.
You know, a lot of people, when they're buying these guitars, they want to play them.
Right.
I mean, there's certain people that are just going to, you know, hang it on a wall or put it in their collection. But, I mean, people want to play them, want to know what they sound like.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I know, you know, Martin obviously has a huge collection of Martin guitars. Did you guys ever try and acquire the Jimmy Rogers Blue Yodel guitar?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah?
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. I mean, there could have been conversations about it, but... yeah, nothing that I know of. Out
of all of the famous Martin guitars like, you know, Willie Nelson's famous Martin guitar, why this guitar? Why does this one capture people's attention? And, you know, when they publish lists of the most valuable guitars in the world, this one is often close, if not at the top of the list. What about this particular guitar makes it so valuable?
You know, it's such a unique instrument because, one, it was owned by the father of country music.
Right.
I mean, you talk about influential artists. I mean, Jimmy Rogers, when it comes to country music, you know, he's at the top because so many musicians looked up to him for so long. And then two, it's just unique.
Right.
I mean, you're not going to find anything else like that. I mean, a pre-war D45, yeah, it's rare and collectible. But if you put two 1942 D45s next to each other, they're going to look the same.
Right.
But nothing is going to look like Jimmy Rogers' Blue Yodel.
Right. Absolutely. I think we've hit pretty much everything I had on the list.
Okay.
Anything else related to Jimmy Rogers? So I guess that this wasn't an endorsement guitar, because there's another famous Jimmy Rogers guitar, the Wayman guitar, that you see pictures of him with. Mm-hmm. But that was kind of an endorsement deal. And what I've heard / read is that he really didn't play that guitar very much. He played that Martin. So this wasn't an endorsement deal. He physically ordered and bought this guitar.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because Martin had the stance for the longest time that it doesn't matter who you were. You could be Jimmy Rogers, the most popular musician in the United States. You're still going to buy a guitar like everybody else. It's just the way they were.
Right.
I've read so many letters from musicians back in the 20s and 30s saying, hey, if you give me this guitar, I'll give you all this free publicity.
Right.
Martin was never interested in it.
Really?
No, they thought, you should buy your guitar like everybody else. And yeah, that's what Jimmy Rogers did.
That's pretty funny.
I mean, because if you look at it, they were a small company. They didn't really have the wiggle room to just give musicians guitars and, Well,
and you'll end up giving a guitar to everybody. Like, I mean, like once you start with one person, it kind of snowballs into, a whole bunch of other things. Martin has never, you guys do the signature models, but you've never really, like you said, never really done endorsement deals, have you?
No. I mean, we have, our ambassador program and things like that, but I know some other companies out there are very liberal with what they will give artists. And
right.
And it's one of those things that when we do a signature edition, it's for somebody that we know has been a longtime Martin artist.
Right.
And they chose Martin not because they were going to get a free guitar from us. It was because they liked the sound and the feel of a Martin
guitar. Right.
Exactly. They knew it would give them the best tone.
Oh, here's the other question I had, because when I was talking to Wayne Henderson, obviously some of the really collectible Martin guitars are the golden era shade top guitars or sunburst guitars, because Martin really didn't make a lot of sunburst guitars. And Wayne and I were speaking a little bit about that. Was that a conscious thing? Was it saying, hey, we select great wood and we want you to see the wood and we're not trying to cover anything up like other guitar companies who make 4-piece tops, spray a bunch of stuff on it to cover up all the seams and stuff? Was that a conscious decision, or was it just something that never really entered into the Martin thought process?
Well, I mean, it came out of consumer demand, and Martin building arch tops in the early 1930s because
Right.
during the Great Depression, they were trying to come up with new ways to compete with other companies, like mainly Gibson and Epiphone, companies that were larger than them.
Right.
So they started building arch top guitars and using sunburst finish, or what we call an amber tone finish, and it just came out of that.
Right.
And it was never, like you said, some companies are trying to cover up flaws or anything. It was more about consumer demand.
Okay.
That's what people wanted.
Right.
And that's, how we offer guitars now. If you want some kind of sunburst finish, whether it's standard or something custom, we will do it.
Right. Paint it blue. Put a,
Done that before. Yeah.
If you're buying your guitar, you can ask for it any way that you want, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's going to go through our custom shop, and you're going to pay a little extra for it, but
right.
You have that option if you want it.
And so when you do a custom guitar, you can choose it like they'll still use hide glue. Do you use hide glue and stuff on your vintage series guitars and stuff still?
Yeah. Our authentic series, we use hide glue because that's would have been used back in the 1930s.
Right.
So that switch came when the Sycamore Street factory opened. Martin started using modern wood glues.
Okay.
But then when we got into building authentics it's like around 2005, we started using hide glue again.
Right.
And then there is a cost factor involved if you want hide glue. It's factored into the cost of the authentics, but say you just want to build a D28, but you want it with hide glue. It's going to cost you more than standard wood glue because it's a lot harder to work with.
Right. Right. Well, what does the future of Martin guitars look like? What do you guys, like you mentioned sustainability. We've talked about alternate woods for guitars, alternate materials for guitars. What's on the horizon for a company like Martin? Do you try and continue to grow? Is it still a family company? What's up with Martin in the future?
Well, Martin is still owned by the Martin family. Christian Frederick Martin IV,
Wow.
Chris Martin. He's our chairman of the board. And he has a daughter, Claire Frances Martin, that I think his plan at one point is when is to pass the company to her to keep it in the family.
So she would be the first female running the company, or has there been females in the past?
We did have a president, female president, Jackie Renner, that was with the company for a few years, but never a female CEO.
Right.
So that would be a first. But beyond that, it's definitely looking at sustainability. That's a key.
Right.
About 70% of the woods we use now come from sustainable forests, and we want to keep growing that number. And the key is when you're harvesting from a sustainable forest, a section's cleared and replanted, and 30 years from now, it should look like when you come back to the area, it was never harvested.
Right.
And in these forests, you're talking about forests in Africa and India down into South America. They're huge, but they have to be managed that way in order for the species of woods that we use to survive.
Right.
So there's that factor, and there's also the factor of continuously exploring different woods to use,
right,
or different materials. Like I mentioned, high pressure laminate for the back and the sides. We also use another wood fiber composite called Rich Light to replicate ebony fingerboards and bridges on some of our models. So, there are alternatives out there.
Right.
You can build a guitar with that's going to feel and sound just as good as if you were building with solid wood.
Now, Martin is kind of, I guess, the iconic guitar, one of the iconic guitars, and the dreadnought shape is, kind of, I think when people think of a guitar, the first thing that jumps into people's mind is a Martin D18 or D28.
Yeah.
Because that's what you've seen for decades. What do you see in popular music? Do you see that trend changing? I see more artists using smaller body guitars now. Do you guys see a trend to different sizes of guitars? And what is the future of guitars and music in general now that everything is computer-based?
Well, our most popular model is still the D28. So I don't think that's going anywhere. Just it's that classic workhorse acoustic guitar. Like you said, a lot of people, I think, when they think of an acoustic guitar, the D28 comes to mind.
Right.
And then you go through the list of musicians that have played one throughout the history of popular music.
Right.
you go on and on. So I think the D28 is, going to remain at that top of the, the acoustic guitar food chain for a long time.
Right.
And, guitar styles is kind of cyclical. It's kind of, what's popular now. It changes from time to time.
Right.
There's periods of the company where they were building more smaller bodies, and then went to, fewer and larger bodies were more fashionable. But it's kind of a mix now. There's those, when you're talking like bluegrass or country,
right,
a lot of times you're going to see a dreadnought.
Yes.
But, folk music, there's dreadnoughts played, or blues music, but a lot of times those artists like a smaller body, like a triple O.
Right.
And I mean, in kind of the digital age, a large majority of the guitars that we build are acoustic electrics, or you have the option of getting electronics installed on pretty much any of our guitars.
Right.
And so that's a huge factor into it too. And,
right.
That was always the challenge, was trying to capture the sound of an acoustic guitar in electronics. And
not easy.
No, exactly. No. But we work a lot with Fishman and LR Baggs, and, it's really closer than it's ever been now.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how close it is now compared to the old first, what did they call those? The thin lines or the underset?
Yeah, the thin line pickups.
Those original ones that were kind of tinny, hollow sounding. But so if a person's a guitar fan and they want to make a pilgrimage to Martin Guitars, do you offer factory tours, and can people play vintage guitars at Martin? Or tell us a little bit about what the experience of visiting the Martin factory is like.
Well, we do offer factory tours Monday through Friday. You can find the information on our website. The fee for the tour is $5, which goes to the Martin Guitar Charitable Foundation. We also have our museum here, which our museum is open 8:30 a.m. through 4:30 p.m. Monday through Friday. It's a self-guided tour. We have roughly 180 instruments on display and different kinds of ephemera from throughout the history of the company. I mean, unfortunately, you can't play any vintage guitars.
Right.
But you can play newer guitars that we have either in our lobby, or we have an area called our pick and parlor.
Wow.
Where we have, you could play some of our higher end guitars, like our modern deluxe models or some standard series guitars in there.
Right. Because I know a friend of mine, he's a dealer, and he visited the Martin factory, and I think he got to play Hank Williams' D18 guitar or something like that. So
yeah, so there's certain privileges to being dealers. Sometimes we'll do that.
That's staggering, though. Is there an active? I know I asked if you guys had ever tried to acquire the Blue Yodel guitar. Do you guys actively seek out guitars for sale, or are there certain holes in your collection that are kind of on a hit list? Tell us a little bit about the acquisition policy if you want to measure these guitars and stuff like that. How do you get the guitars?
Well, we have a team here that when we know something comes up for auction or is up for sale, we get together and discuss it. So it has to fill, certain voids in our collection, or, obviously if it's a good instrument owned by a famous musician, we'll look at that too.
Right.
So, I mean, there's certain years like early OMs, we definitely look at those a lot, because we could use an older OM 28 for our collection, or obviously anything, 1830s, because, there's not a lot of guitars around from the 1830s. So whenever one of those comes available. And then, I mean, we added like the OM 45 Deluxe in our collection. That was added in 2014, because there were only 11 of those built. And we didn't have. So we and a lot of times auction houses that are selling these will alert us, because they kind of know what we're looking for. You're gonna
help their bottom line by being a bidder on it.
Yeah. So or if they're vintage guitar dealers that we know, like recently we bought a 1921 545, which is a size 5.
Wow, in a 45 style. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was the only one the company ever built.
Wow.
So if it's unique like that, we'll look at it. Then we also purchased one of Don McLean's D45s.
Okay.
He played it at Garth Brooks' concert in Central Park, where there were over 1 million people.
Wow.
We acquired that too recently.
That 545 has got to be amazing. The only one I've ever seen, Marty Robbins was probably the most well-known that played a 5 series. And do they call those TERS guitars? TERS?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Because that comes from Latin for third, because traditionally those were tuned to G, a third up from standard pitch.
Oh, okay.
Mhm.
Gotcha. All right. Well, see, learning new stuff.